Welcome back. This is week one, lecture two, the basic structures of Christendom. Now, in the first lecture of this week, I kind of tried to set the contours of this course in terms of the content. I discussed that in the previous lecture. And also in terms of where do we begin, um, in order to discern what is new in this period of transition, we need to see what had come before. Because if we start identifying developments or ideas that we think are new and different when they're actually just traditional, we're going to misunderstand and misrepresent what was going on at the time. So, this lecture is an attempt to, in some ways, discuss or to fit two entire courses that I teach into one: Europe in the early Middle Ages and Europe in the high and later Middle Ages. Of course, as we'll be going further, I'll be dealing with the later Middle Ages for a number of lectures in terms of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. So maybe we could say it's like fitting one course and 2/3 of another course all together. So I will try to simply hit on the high points because there are some elements and concepts of what formed Christendom that we need to understand because, as I think I addressed in the previous lecture, as I will be portraying this transition from approximately 1300 to approximately 1600, it was the transition from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state, or from medieval Europe to early modern Europe. We can go on with other labels we might want to come up with to describe what we observe and how we understand what we observe based on the evidence in terms of what happened and how did Europe change? How did European society, institutions, and ideas and concepts change during this 300-year period that seems to have been somehow so important for our understanding of modernity and therefore for our understanding of ourselves? That's what this is all about. So I'm not going to be giving a summary of everything that is important to understand Christendom or to understand Europe in the Middle Ages at all, but just some basic structures that we will see changing during this period and that we will see coming into crisis during this period. And unless we have some kind of a grasp on what came before the beginnings of this crisis and transformation, we won't understand the transformation itself. Therefore, I begin here with the concept of Christendom. Where did it come from? Why do we refer to it as Christendom? What does it mean? And what did it consist of? So if we turn now to the slide Christendom, I begin by giving a pretty clear definition, or at least what in my mind is a pretty clear definition of Christendom. Christendom is a geopolitical entity defined by the boundaries of Christian worship. Or I should say, it was a geopolitical entity. The problem is Christendom is not the same as Christianity. Today, even every once in a while, you'll come across the word Christendom, and what it refers to today is anywhere and everywhere Christianity is practiced. That's not what I'm meaning by the term in terms of the Middle Ages, but rather Christendom in the medieval context was synonymous with Christianity, at least in the Latin West. And it was not simply a belief or a faith, it was the political entity itself. And so Christendom expanded as what would become to be known as the empire continued to expand. Now, I just said empire, and where does that term come from? Well, to understand the myth of Christendom, because it is a myth in terms of an overarching ideological structure, we need to start with what I've referred to as the myth of Rome and look at the process of the Christianization of Rome. As I hope you know, the Roman Empire was the most extensive empire. It's debatable whether it's the most extensive empire the world has ever seen, but it certainly is one of the most extensive empires the world has ever seen. And for the West, is by far the most important. and has had a lasting effect. Still to today, we can see the impact of the idea of Rome. And what was that idea? Well, Rome was founded in approximately 753 BCE, as we know, according to legend, by Romulus and Remus. I'm not going to go through the whole development of Rome, certainly, but it started out being first early on a kings, led by kings, and then it became a republic in 509 BCE. And that republic, the Roman Republic, with its constitution, which included two chief executive officers, or two members of the executive branch, two consuls, or like two presidents, a Senate, and then eventually a tribunal. So it's almost like, two presidents, a Senate, and a House of Representatives in many ways. And our founding fathers of the United States certainly knew Roman history and knew Roman government, and they had studied it very well. That republic began to expand militarily and geographically to, by the year 200 BCE, controlled all of the Italian peninsula. And not all that long thereafter included then northern Africa, and it kept expanding and expanding and expanding till it went then over the Alps, north of the Alps, and it was a vast empire still as a republic. There's a distinction to be made between an empire as an extent of territory controlled and an empire as an imperial form of government. So the Roman Empire was an empire before it became an empire in some ways, because the Roman Republic, was still an empire, even though it had a republican form of government. But what happened was, you may have heard of this person, Julius Caesar, ended up proclaiming himself dictator, and there's the whole history behind that. And there's basically provisions within the Roman Constitution for someone proclaiming themselves dictator. And it had been done before, but what made Julius Caesar different was he proclaimed himself dictator for life. That was a problem. So senators rose up and in 44 BCE assassinated Julius Caesar, killing the tyrant. Thereafter, after the assassination of Julius Caesar, there was a period of chaos and turmoil. What was going to come next? And eventually, Julius Caesar's nephew, Octavian, came to the fore, beat out his competitors, and was seen as the single ruler of Rome. What he did then in 27 BCE was to say, okay, I've now reestablished order and I'm going to give power back to the Senate. I will not have an official title. I will simply rule as the first citizen. Princeps, first citizen. Except I will retain the title of the chief priest, because that was one of the titles and offices within the Roman Constitution. Because for Cicero, who was very much a figure, if you haven't heard of Cicero, he was a politician, a statesman, a lawyer. He was consul for a couple of years, and he was very much opposed to Caesar, and he spoke fiercely against Caesar. But for Cicero, religion was a civic moral virtue. There's no distinction. This idea, and I'll probably be saying this again and again and again, the concept that we have today of this distinction and separation of church and state, so to speak, we have to get that out of our heads if we have any chance of understanding what was going on in the Middle Ages and on and through the Reformation of the 16th century and beyond, because they're one and the same. You had a duty to be religious. Now, Augustus had to transform the mentality of the population, the other senators, the people. And he did that in a number of ways. And we refer to it as the Augustan Revolution. Why do I say Augustan? And I think I even said Augustan Revolution and Augustus. Because when in 27 BCE, Octavian gave control and power back to the Senate, except for maintaining the position of the chief priest, which in Latin is Pontifex Maximus. Today we still have a chief priest, Pontifex Maximus. That's the Roman Pope. At the time, it wasn't that. It was simply the head priest in Rome that looked after Roman religion, civic religion. Because Octavian knew that religion is important. Because being religious and being a citizen and a patriot are one and the same. is your responsibility. So he kept that title in office, but everything else he gave back to the Senate. And the Senate was so pleased that all of a sudden the Senate didn't just continue with Julius Caesar's proclaiming himself dictator for life, but returned technically power to the Republic in the Senate. They hailed him as the magnificent and the wonderful, which in Latin was Augustus. And we still have that meaning of the term August. He is so august, it's so magnificent. Our month, Augustus, is named after Augustus, who was first named Octavian. But then Octavian did something else to start this Augustan, because he was referred to as Augustan Revolution. He said, you know what, Julius Caesar was a great man. Not only was he a great man, he became a god. He was so great the gods welcomed him into the pantheon. And this began the cult of the emperor. Because all of a sudden now Julius Caesar was raised up to the level of divinity. He had become a god. And Octavian argued then too, Julius Caesar had adopted me as his heir and as his son. Therefore, I am a son of a god. And I'm adopting his name, Caesar. So Octavian became known as Caesar Augustus, the Augustus Caesar. Caesar was originally a name, a family name, before it became a title. And Augustus was an adjective describing magnificence, but then it too became a title and an office. That is a huge transformation when you're going from Octavian having to fight your way in and then militarily establishing yourself to now being Caesar Augustus as the son of the divinized Julius Caesar. How do you go about doing it? There's a whole series of developments he took to help with his image, and really he initiated the first conscious propaganda campaign in Rome. He put his image on coinage consistently, which had not been the case previously. He had statues of himself put up and mandated to be put up in every city, and they had to follow a particular approved model so that people would see the statue and see the same statue everywhere. I think this guy is fantastic. And he said, another way, not only can we control the religion, we also need to control the history and the understanding of the memory. So he commissioned a new history of Rome, and he commissioned a poet named Virgil to write the new history of Rome. And Virgil did, and it was his masterwork known as the Aeneid. And the Aeneid portrayed both Caesar Augustus and then Julius Caesar before him as part of this divine decree whereby Rome would be an empire without end, bounded only by the heavens and the oceans, by Jupiter, which is the Roman version of the Greek Zeus. And prophecies were made. It's an amazing piece of work. And in my early medieval class, I talk a lot more about it. But here, the point is that Virgil put forward this idea for Augustus of this divinely sanctioned eternal empire of Rome. You may have heard that Rome is the eternal city. That's where it comes from. And it's that ideal that was to have such an impact on Christendom. Why? Because when Virgil's writing, he finishes the Aeneid in 19 BCE and dies. Or he doesn't finish it because for him it was unfinished. But he dies in 19 BCE. But it's still under the reign of Caesar Augustus, as we know from the Gospel of Luke. But a decree went out that all the world should be taxed. Mary and Joseph went from their town of Nazareth down to Bethlehem, the city and town of David, and there where Mary gave birth to Jesus, another son of God, or so the story goes. So the earliest beginnings of Christianity, the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, his early missions and preaching endeavors, and his crucifixion and death are all within the context of the Roman Empire and the early days of the Roman Empire under Caesar Augustus and then his successors. We have to see it in those terms. Now, Christianity took a little while to catch on. I'm not going to go into all of this because we'd be here all day. I'm still already way behind schedule because I didn't mean to spend this much time on all of this, but it's important to understand what's coming. And it's not really until the first century CE that we start hearing the word Christians. It had been a Jewish sect, and there had been a number of different Jewish sects, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There were also the Essenes and the Zealots, and on we could go. And this new movement was referred to as the Jesus movement or the Easter movement because his followers had proclaimed that he had risen from the dead. And it was a Jewish sect. Now, there is also an event recorded in the Christian Bible in the book of Acts, Acts of the Apostles, that was really important, which is often referred to as the First Ecumenical Council, the Council of Jerusalem, where two of Jesus' followers, Peter and Paul, confronted each other. And the question was, to become a Christian, to join this new movement, do you also have to become Jewish? Do you have to follow Jewish law? Or is this new movement separate from Christianity, or separate from, Judaism? Can you be then a follower of Jesus, of this Jesus movement, if you're not first Jewish? And that's a complex discussion, but it went on, and the solution was that yes, you could be, but for Peter, he would be the apostle to the Jews, and Paul would be the apostle to the Gentiles, the non-Jews. And Paul of Tarsus, who was a Pharisee and a Roman citizen, went on 3 separate missionary journeys and was probably more influential and important in a way in terms of spreading what became known as Christianity than was Jesus of Nazareth himself. Because Paul was indefatigable, tireless. I probably didn't pronounce that correctly. Indefatigable, and he was on fire. He believed. He had supposedly a divine conversion, and he believed it wholeheartedly. And he spread that message. He spread the gospel, the good news, the evangelium, which is what gospel translates into, the good news of Jesus of Nazareth, and established communities. Now, in Latin, the term for community or group or gathering was ecclesia, which it translates in English as churches. Paul established these churches, but they were actually just gatherings. And the term ecclesia predated Paul, predated Christianity. It was a Latin term. It was fine. Gathering, community, congregation. But it became a Christian term. Now, the Romans were skeptical. They had dealt with some problems with the Jews. They had worked out kind of a solution. They were weird, but at least there was some sort of symbiotic working relationship, at least with most of the Jews. There were sections of the Jews, sects of the Jews, the Zealots, for example, that were always stood in opposition to Rome and the power of Rome. The Essenes had just withdrawn from society and didn't want to really have much to do with any of it. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees were the ones who, especially the Pharisees, were the ones who were the good, upstanding, middle class, upper middle class Jewish Roman citizens who worked out an accommodation with Rome, and it worked. Now, all of a sudden, there was this newfangled sect coming along. What do we do with it? There are waves of persecution. It was never a constant Roman persecution of Christians. It was a process. And it actually worked against the intent of the Romans because it made martyrs. And martyrs became the heroes of the early Christian movement. Now, in 303, the Emperor Diocletian, who actually was a brilliant administrator, Diocletian has gotten a lot of bad press, split the empire into 2, east and west, administratively. He would be the emperor in the east, and his partner Maxentius would be the emperor in the west. They would each then have a co-Caesar ruling underneath them, so that was called the tetrarchy, a 4-part rule. I'm sorry, I'm beginning to see how much time I'm spending on this, and it is important for what is coming. So I will evaluate the time faction as I go, or I'll try to, but that's also kind of why I'm trying to hurry through this as quickly as possible because it's important. And he thought we were going to get rid of the Christians too, once and for all. So he initiated what's called the Great Persecution in 303. By this time, it's been estimated approximately 10% of the population were Christian. You can't really get rid of 10% of the population very easily. And the Great Persecution failed. There's a lot of other consequences, developments out of the Great Persecution, which I'm not going to be able to talk about here and now. But it failed, and Diocletian and Maxentius retired and abdicated. And to make, again, a complex series of developments, simplified and jumping to the outcome, so to speak, what arose out of the Tetrarchy was the ascendancy of a man by the name of Constantine. And Constantine was able finally to make his claim to be Emperor of Rome. And after winning a battle in 312 CE, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, in which he, according to tradition, had seen a vision, a cross in the sky, and the words, "In this sign conquer, in hoc signo vinces," and then had his soldiers paint the signs of the cross on their shields, and he won and established himself as emperor of Rome, the entire Roman Empire, eventually. I mean, it took him a little bit longer than 313, or 312. As a result, in 313, after this victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan that made Christianity a legal religion. Often it is portrayed of Constantine as being the first Christian emperor. It's very debatable. He still, for most of the rest of his life, still appealed to the sun god. The Sol Invictus was his motto. But there's little question or denying that from 313 on, or 312 on, he privileged the Christians. He was interested in what was going on. And it was Emperor Constantine who called the Council of Nicaea in 325 that set the creed for the Christianity, what they would believe, a statement of belief and faith, that set what writings would be part of Scripture, Holy Scripture, and it began condemning Arius, or Arian, or heresy. We could go all into that, but heresy was seen as a crime against the state because religion was a matter of the government, of the state, of being a citizen. Now, once something is a heresy is proclaimed a heresy, doesn't mean that all of a sudden, number one, it no longer exists, or number two, that if ever anyone was ever seen to adhere to those positions, that the officials would seek them out and execute them. That's not what it meant in any way, shape, or form. They were Arian Christians for quite a long time, and just as a footnote, Arians meant that they believed in Christianity. They believed that Jesus was Savior and all that, but they denied the pre-existence of Jesus as the second person of the Trinity. They felt that Jesus had been divinized, had a very special relationship with God, and had become the second person of the Trinity. That position was denied. But there were many Germanic tribes outside the borders of the empire that started to believe in that Arian form of Christianity. It made sense. In some ways, made more sense than the second person of a Trinity becoming incarnate. What does that mean? Anyway, in time, Christianity, this 4th century, amazing 4th century, Christianity went from being a persecuted religion in 303 to 305 to then a legal religion. So it was illegal to be Christian in Rome. Then to be a legal religion in 313, to by the end of the century in 391 under Emperor Theodosius, who proclaimed Christianity the only legal religion of the Roman Empire. A massive transformation. And we see the political, theological, religious unity. Because to be a Roman citizen then after 391 meant that you were Christian by definition. At least legally, you're supposed to be. That's the idea. What was Christianity then? Christianity became fused with the myth of Rome as this eternal, divinely sanctioned empire. And that was to continue even after the so-called fall of Rome, which never happened. There was no such thing as the fall of Rome. What happened was in 476, the emperor in the West was deposed. After Theodosius died in 395, he split the empire again between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west, as had Diocletian. So there was a precedence for that. And the emperor in the east just continued. So when in 476, Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain, we're not really quite sure his ethnicity other than Germanic, deposed Romulus Augustulus as the emperor in the west. That was the last Roman emperor in the west. But the emperor in the east remained, and Odoacer even had an arrangement with the emperor in the east. And when a new Germanic tribe started taking power north of the Alps, they did so certainly knowing about the emperor in the east and in communication with the emperor of the east. Clovis was the first king of the United Franks. The Franks were a number of different Germanic tribes, and they were all united under Clovis in the later 5th century. So this is after the power of Rome in the West had declined, the administrative power. Because even though I said it didn't fall, we certainly see a receding of Roman administrative authority and power in the West with the deposition of Romulus Augustulus. The legionaries started going back towards Rome. What was left were the administrative structure or skeletal structure, not with power or authority, but the skeletal structure, which Diocletian too had established. He had established a new administrative structure, not only provinces, but also then more smaller administrative units called dioceses. And the leader of a diocese was called an episcopus, an overseer. And Christians just took all that over, whereby we have an episcopus, an overseer, as the leader of a diocese. And in English, the term episcopus is translated as bishop. So we have bishops in their diocese, and still today, you can't have a bishop who's not part of a diocese, who's not a leader of a diocese, and therefore also has a cathedral. You can't have a cathedral without a bishop. You can't have a bishop without a cathedral. That's the bishop's church. That's the bishop's chair, the cathedra, which is an administrative chair, like a throne. And bishops were important. Bishops still remained after Roman administrative authority and power receded. So when Clovis comes along, he's trying to reestablish some sort of military cohesion north of the Alps. And right at the end of the 5th century, he has a conversion experience. Now, the sources relate it very much like Constantine's. He received help in a battle, praying to God, a battle that he was losing very badly, but then he said, he was married to a Bavarian princess who was Christian. He said, please help me, the God of my wife. I will believe in you if you help me win. And all of a sudden, his enemies started to flee, and Clovis achieved a great victory. So the story goes. We have no way of knowing whether that was actually an historical event or not. But what we do know is that Clovis established himself militarily within Central Europe, let's say, and he became Christian. And not only Christian, he became Roman Christian. He became Orthodox. He followed the Pope in Rome. And Pope just means Papa, okay? Pope just means Papa. But the Bishop of Rome was an important bishopric, as was the Bishop of Constantinople, the Bishop of Jerusalem, the Bishop of Alexandria, known as the Patriarchs. On we go. But the Bishop of Rome was trying from very early on to assert his authority and primacy over all other bishops. That Rome would reign supreme. After all, Rome was the city where both Peter and Paul were martyred, and both were buried there under St. Peter's. No other bishop could claim that. Yeah. That's what we're getting into with these Franks. They had a special relationship with the papacy from very early on, and that was just to continue and grow. Whereby then we see finally under one of Clovis's successors, so to speak, even though there's a change of dynasty, under the Frankish king Charles. Charles I'm not going to go into all of the developments from Clovis to Charles. There's some major important ones, whereby it's called the Franco-Papal Alliance. Charles's father had arranged with the Pope and had given the Pope central Italy to rule as a territory, which is known as the Papal States. And it was called the Franco-Papal Alliance because the Pope gave Pepin, was his name, Charlemagne's father, authority to depose the last of the previous dynasty, the Frankish dynasty, the Merovingians, and to assume being king of the Franks. So Pepin got the legitimacy from the Pope, and the Pope got the political power of ruling central Italy. And Charlemagne adhered to that Franco-Papal alliance and supporting the papacy, and the papacy would call on the Franks to help the papacy militarily and all that. Now we'll see later on. I mean, supposedly priests and bishops aren't supposed to fight. We'll see that in a second, but that is simply a theory, and they certainly did. But we'll get there when we get there. But the crowning of Charles as emperor was a big one. This is a Christmas Day 800. And I say Charles because that was his name in English. He was seen as an amazing person, became known as Charles the Great, because he was truly great. In French, then, Charles the Great is Charlemagne, or Charlemagne. And often in English, we just use the French Charlemagne. But in Latin, it's Carolus Magnus. And in German, it's Karl der Große. And in French, it's Charlemagne, or Charlemagne. And in English, it's Charles the Great. But Charlemagne had come once again to the Pope's defense, and the Pope was so pleased, he crowned Charles Roman Emperor, not Holy Roman Emperor. You'll often read or see that Charlemagne was the first Holy Roman Emperor. No, he was not. He was Roman Emperor. Now, how could that be? Because I already said that Rome never fell and that the Emperor was already in the East, and that's very true. The problem was, according to the Pope and bishops in the West, the Patriarch, both the Emperor and the Bishop of Constantinople, had fallen into heresy there in Constantinople in the East. And there has been an increasing split between the Western Latin Church and the Eastern Greek Church. And they really couldn't even communicate that well anymore at all. The Eastern was Greek-speaking, Western was Latin-speaking, whereas under Constantine still they were very much, any educated person was bilingual in Greek and Latin. That was beginning to split and go asunder. Already in this early 6th century, we see that lack of knowledge of Greek in the West falling by the wayside. But the point being is that with the emperor in the East being a heretic in the eyes of the West, what that meant was it was therefore no longer an emperor. There was an imperial vacancy, because you can't have a Christian emperor who is a heretic. It's a contradiction in terms, so it's as good as being dead. Since there's an imperial vacancy, it fell to the Pope to name the new emperor. And the Pope could do that because supposedly Constantine had, before he died, back in 330 CE, had decided to move the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, the city of Constantine. According to legend, he had asked the Pope to kind of take over rulership of the West. That's a complete myth and fabrication. We'll come back to that. It's called the Donation of Constantine. It was a forgery, did not exist. But for Constantine, that was an administrative move and was important. Even though the Donation of Constantine was a myth, the idea was, for the Pope crowning Charlemagne, that it was the papal sanction that had allowed Constantine to move to the east. So the idea was, it was called the translation of the empire. Translation just means moving, the translatio, the bringing across. And it's like, okay, if the Pope has the power to translate the capital, the seat of the empire, this eternal, divinely sanctioned empire, from the Latins to the Greeks, he can move it from the Greeks to the Germans. And that's what he did in crowning Charlemagne. So he crowned Charlemagne Roman Emperor. That's the mentality. The same Roman emperor that had been Constantine, that had been Theodosius, that had been Diocletian, that had been Caesar Augustus. The very same office, the very same understanding of the office. Now, Charlemagne's empire was huge. Charlemagne controlled more territory himself than any other Roman emperor since Theodosius. All of Central Europe. He kept expanding it into the north and Scandinavia, northern Italy. Papal states certainly adhered to the empire. So it was a massive empire, but it was nothing like what Rome had been at their height. Now, it's at Charlemagne's court that we first begin to find the term Imperium Christianum, the Christian Empire, and Populus Christianus, the Christian people. So we have the Christian people and the Christian Empire fusing under this concept of the reestablishment of the Roman Empire in the West with the crowning of Charlemagne as Roman Emperor. This eternal empire sanctioned by God that would be eternal. That idea was there and remained. Now, it's not only until after Charlemagne, and Europe was split after he dies in 814, eventually between his three grandsons, in the Treaty of Verdun, which basically set the boundaries of what would become, in some ways, modern Europe. Because one grandson got the eastern part of Charlemagne's empire, one got the central part, and one got the western part, which became kind of France, Germany, and then this middle part was the grandson's name was Lothar. There's all kinds of fun stories about all of this because they're fighting constantly. It was the region of Lothar. Lothar got the title of emperor, but the let's say the booby prize in terms of territory, that central part between the western and the eastern Frankish Empire was then known as Lothar's territory, or Lotharingia, or in French, the Lorraine. If you know anything about European history up through World War I, World War II, the Lorraine or Lotharingia has been what France and Germany have been fighting over for centuries and centuries and centuries, and all goes back to the Treaty of Verdun in 843. Now, that's not really the point of all this, but that's is important to get that in mind because, two, both the King of France and Germany, but Germany doesn't become unified until 871. I'll get in there. And this territory in between, Lotharingia, claimed direct descendants from Charlemagne, from the emperor. And so there was a tense relationship between the King of France, or what became the King of France, and the emperor. The emperor was technically above the King of France, but the King of France said, well, but I'm still descended from Charlemagne and ruled directly for God. So there's tensions there, and we'll see those breaking out later on. But in theory, the emperor was in charge of it all. Now, we'll get to that more later. But that's kind of what we're looking at. And the concept was, even though there are divisions within, even though and Christian princes would fight all kinds of places, there was this overarching concept that altogether we are the Christian empire, the Christian people. And in some ways, I made the analogy to a family. Families can fight amongst themselves very viciously. There can be bitter divisions within a family. But so often, if someone outside attacks the family, they rally the wagons and they all are unified against the common enemy. With brothers, I didn't have a brother, but I knew brothers growing up. I had a sister, which is a very different dynamic. But I know brothers, one family going through elementary school and all the way through high school. They fought terribly with each other, physically and violently at times. But if anybody else started a fight with any one of the brothers, all three of the brothers would come together to fight that person off. That's the concept of Christendom. Was there such a unified concept? No. Was it simply an age of faith led by the Pope? Absolutely not, as we'll see. Not at all. But that concept, that ideology, is important to see what would come later, because it's that myth of Christendom that would be transformed into something else. And that's what this course is all about. Now, that is just the beginning of the basic structures of Christendom, because that's just getting to what Christendom was. Trying to think how I should handle this, because I know time is running, but I'll see what I can get through. If we look at the Middle Ages, there are two terms that are often confused, but very much seemingly related. One is manorialism, and the other is feudalism. We often talk about feudal Europe. But I just want to make some distinctions here, because this too will be important for our understanding of the transformations that happened in the course of the later Middle Ages and on into the 16th century and thereafter. Manorialism was the economic, as I think I have up there on the slide, the economic and social system of Christendom. It consisted of peasants and lords, the lord of a manor. And a lord of a manor, which would usually be a knight, and I'll talk about knights when I get to feudalism, was responsible for protecting the people who worked on the manor. There was rights and privileges. The peasants had rights, the right to farm, hunt, fish, and collect firewood, but the lords had rights to receive taxes from the production of the peasants. The responsibilities of the peasants, and they still had responsibilities, was to work on the Lord's domain, the territory that the Lord kept for himself, and to pay taxes in kind. The responsibility of the Lords was to protect the manor and its inhabitants, and to provide for, I'm just reading what is on the stupid PowerPoint slide here, its inhabitants, and to provide for the spiritual and physical well-being of the manor. And there then next proprietary churches, because the mentality of this was, if I'm the Lord of the manor, I have to protect my people. I'm responsible for them. I will have to answer to God for my people. And it doesn't mean that every Lord of the Manor had that sense of responsibility, but theoretically, that was what was there. And the church was important. Call it a proprietary church because the Lord would have to provide a church for the manor. And it was seen as my church, my church. That's what proprietary means. I own it. In German, it's Eichenkirchen, my own church. That's going to be very important, because that means I'm in charge of keeping the priest, appointing a new priest when need be, and all those other things to provide for the spiritual well-being of my people. Now, when the Lord of a manor is a knight or a noble, the same mentality is there as it is when for princes and kings. If I'm a king, I am responsible for my people, spiritually as well as physically. And I have to answer to God for that. That's my mentality. And so I provide the best churches I can provide, the best clergy and priests I can find. That's the manorial system and how it ends up playing out. Feudalism, there on the next slide, I say is the cultural and political system of Christendom. And technically, feudalism is based on the term feudum in Latin, F-E-U-D-U-M, feudum. And a feudum in English was called, or Old English, which we've kept, a fief. And a fief is a grant of land. And technically, a fief is a grant of land to support one knight. And so there's no absolute dimensions of what is a fief. A fief in Tuscany would be a lot smaller, meaning to support one knight, than it would be up in northern Germany, because you need more land to support one knight. It also then referred to just grants of land in general. So if I'm a prince or if I'm a king, if I say to a friend of mine, I will grant you this part of my land as a fief if you provide for me knights when I need them so we can fight together. It's a system of mutual responsibilities and privileges. And it's bound by honor, and it's bound by ritual, and it's bound by law. And to contravene feudal law was you don't do. And we'll see some of those conflicts when we get there. So again, let's say this mutual responsibility. I have it there on the slide sub-infeudation because if I'm a king, I can parcel out properties to my friends, and then they can parcel out properties to their friends. And further down the line, we could have some real problems because if the third or fourth layer of that sub-infeudation process, that person might also have fiefs from someone else. And so when everybody is called up for battle, if that person is called by two ultimate lords, what do? So there's an inherent structural problem within within feudalism that did begin to show its signs and crack apart. Another thing about feudalism, um, I mentioned feudal law, and that's how we kind of know about it. There are scholars who say we should get rid of the term feudalism because, based on feudal law that was codified in the 12th century, we see it as a top down structure. But historically, it developed from bottom up. So we just need to keep that in mind. But that idealized version of feudal law and feudal structure is going to be central for understanding how we go about it. As is then that next slide, which I have, is the inherent problems in the structure, not only in terms of sub-infeudation, but another idealized structure known as the three orders. And the three orders were those who fought, or the nobility, the clergy, or those who prayed, and the peasants, those who worked. The Latin term ordo was a very important word. It was used for all types of things. Here is basically referring to different types of or classes of people. There's only three: nobility, clergy, or peasant. So if you weren't a member of the clergy, an ordained member of the clergy, if you weren't a nobleman, you were by definition a peasant. That structure stayed. That structure stayed until the French Revolution. Because ordo in Latin became estates in French. We talk about the three estates. If any of you have had the French Revolution, studied it in either in Western Civ or courses on the French Revolution, you'll know that's what was going on. And the Oath of the Tennis Court in 1789 was vowing to overturn how votes were cast in the Estates General, the general estates, or the legislature, the parliament, the French parliament. Because it used to be based on the three orders. So there were three votes. The clergy got a vote, the nobility got a vote, and then everybody else got a vote. So the clergy and the nobility could always outvote the peasants, which were everybody else. That was overturned in the Oath of the Tennis Court in the French Revolution. Anyway, but that structure was there from the 12th century, ideally on. It was a problem, and there were inherent problems and conflicts and structures therein too. Why? Because beginning in about the year 1000, the population starts taking off and booming in Europe. And we have the establishment of new cities and towns and communes. And we have then merchants and artisans within those towns and communes. And some of these artisans and merchants were becoming extremely wealthy. We also have the beginnings of banking and finance. They were becoming wealthy, but they were classified as peasants. Some of these cities and towns from very early on thought, you know what? We don't want to really have to deal with our feudal overlord, the prince, who is our direct lord. So what if we petition the king to give us our rights to be directly under his authority and to treat us as a single body, as a single person, in fact? Now, the Lord, the king, said that's a pretty good idea. So we have incorporated cities. In French are called communes. And within the empire, I'll be talking more about the empire, were called free imperial cities, or the Reichsstädte, the imperial cities, who were directly under the emperor, outside the feudal hierarchy and structure. And with the communes in France, right under the king, that means they're outside of the normal control and normal kind of flow chart of organization. They got a lot of benefit from it, but so did the kings and the emperors.